have endeavored in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my hearers out of humor with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt you pleasantly. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it. And Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew that he was dead? Of course he did. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, however. There it stood years afterward above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted, hand-at-the-grindstone Scrooge, a squeezing, retching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Extraordinary heat and cold had little influence on him. No warmth could warm, no cold could chill him. Nobody ever stopped him at the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather. And the city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. The door to Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of a tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself with the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" "Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do. What's Christmas time but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer? If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on their lips should be boiled in their own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through their heart." "Uncle!" "Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then. Much good it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I have derived good, by which I have not profited. I dare say Christmas among the rest. But I am sure that I have always thought of Christmas time, apart from the veneration due to its sacred origin, as a good time, a kind, forgiving time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem of one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely. And therefore, Uncle, though it has not put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed, he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" cried the nephew. "Why? Why did you get married?" "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon. I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I am a party, but I will keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon, and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon." The nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers with them and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago this very night." "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up his pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons, but a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing." "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they had rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, said, "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" "If quite convenient, sir." "It is not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound." "Yes, sir." "And yet you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "It's only once a year, sir." "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk ran home as fast as he could pelt. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. The building was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. Now it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of the house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge has seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence in that place. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. He said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs. Up Scrooge went, not carrying a button for it being very dark. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that it was all right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Quite satisfied, he closed his door, locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before a very low fire to take his gruel. As he threw back his head in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room. And it was with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable dread that, as he looked, he saw the bell begin to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below him, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight toward his door. It came through the heavy door, and a spectre passed into the room before his eyes. And upon its coming in, the dying flame leapt up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. His body was transparent. Though he looked the phantom through and through, and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of its cold death eyes, and noticed the very texture of the folded handkerchief bound around about its head and chin, he was still incredulous. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" "I can." "Do it then." The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me. I don't. Why do you doubt your senses? Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blob of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There is more of gravy than the grave about you, whatever you are. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage around its head, its lower jaw dropping down to its breast. Mercy, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me? It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men, and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. A very little more time is permitted to me. I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me. In life, my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead, and traveling all the time. You travel fast? On the wings of the wind. You might have gotten over quite a quantity of ground in 7 years. Oh, blind man, not to know that no space of regret can make amends for life's opportunities missed. Yet, I was once like this man. I was once like this man. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who was now beginning to apply this to himself. Business! Cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. Hear me. My time is nearly gone. I will, but don't be hard on me, Jacob. I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer. You were always a good friend to me, thank ye. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow night, when the bell tolls 1. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us. It walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the apparition reached it, it was wide open. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, just as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed, without undressing, and fell asleep on the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish between the transparent window from the walls of his chamber, until suddenly the clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up into the room at that instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure. Like a child, yet not so like a child, but like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium. Its hair, which was wrung about its neck and down its back, was white as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle upon it, and the tenderest bloom was upon the skin. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, and in singular contradiction to that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a clear jet of light, by which all of this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. "Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?" "I am." "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. The things that you will see with me are the shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us." Scrooge then made bold to inquire what business brought him there. "Your welfare. Rise and walk with me." He rose, but finding the spirit heading toward the window, clasped his robe in supplication. I am mortal and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand," said the spirit, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of the city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops there that here, too, it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? Why, I was apprenticed here." They went in. At the sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he had been 2 inches taller, he must have knocked his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig, alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capricious waistcoat, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self, a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," the Scrooge said to the ghost. "My fellow prentice, bless me, yes. He was very attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "Yo-ho, me boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here." Clear away? There was nothing that they wouldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, the floor was swept, the lamps were trimmed, the fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would have desired to look upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with his music book, and went up to the lofty desk and made an orchestra of it. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the three Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed by the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In they all came, one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyway and everyhow. There were dances, and there were more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and there were mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and the boiled, when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood at their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wishing him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 prentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. "Why, he has spent just a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves your praise?" "It isn't that, Spirit," said Scrooge. "He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or toil." He felt the Spirit's glance and stopped. "What's the matter?" Nothing particular." "Something, I think." No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." "My time grows short," observed the Spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone that he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. He was not alone, but sat at the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes there were tears. "It matters little," she said softly to Scrooge's former self. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me." "What idol has displaced you?" "A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler ambitions fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?" "What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then?" "I am not changed toward you. Have I ever sought release from our engagement?" "In words, no, never." "In what then?" "In a changed nature, in an altered spirit. If you were free today, can you even believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? I release you, with a full heart, with the love of him you once were." "Spirit, remove me from this place." "I told you that these were the shadows of things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are, do not blame me." "Remove me!" Scrooge exclaimed. "I cannot bear it. Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." As he struggled with the Spirit, he was conscious of being exhausted and overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. Awakening, Scrooge found himself in his bedroom. There was no doubt about that. But it, and his own adjoining sitting room, into which he shuffled in his slippers, attracted by a great light there, had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were so hung with living green. The leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if many little mirrors had been scattered there. And a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney. Heaped upon the floor, to form sort of a throne, were turkeys, geese, game, brawn, great joints of meat, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and great bowls of punch. In easy state upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light upon Scrooge as he came peeping around the door. Come in and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the like of me before." "Never." "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these late years?" pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have. I am afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, Spirit?" "More than 1,800. A tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. The room, with all of its contents, vanished instantly, and they stood upon the city streets, upon a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on, invisible, straight to Scrooge's clerks, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that! The ghost of Christmas present blessed Bob's poor four-posted house. Up rose Mrs. Cratchit, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged his fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property conferred upon the son in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in the luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire, until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "Whatever has gotten your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha warn't as late last Christmas by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times, and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you have come," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless you." No, no, there's Father coming, cried the two little Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. Hide, Martha, hide! So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and he had his limbs supported with an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. Not coming, said Mrs. Cratchit. Not coming, said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church. Not coming upon Christmas Day. Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did our little Tim behave? Asked Mrs. Cratchit. As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much. He thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made beggars walk and blind men see. Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him to a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody. At last, the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two younger Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" There never was such a goose. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break when turning out. Suppose someone should have gotten over the wall into the backyard and stole it while they were making merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello! A great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quantrum of ignited brandy, and with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Everyone had something to say about it, and nobody thought that it was a small pudding for such a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, the fire made up. The compound in the jug was tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff in the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, last of all. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "with a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit, say that he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it, and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and overcome with penitence and grief. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here to give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "Oh, my dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure," said she, "on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, dear fellow." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her, but it was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care a pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter being a man of business. Martha, who was a poor apprentice in a milliner's, told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and by they had a song from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were rather scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier in the bright sprinkling of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, as the scene vanished, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit smiling by his side and looking at that same nephew. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and the assembled friends, being not a bit behindhanded, laughed as lustily. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live!" cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. And he's not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Who suffers for his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come to dine with us. What's the consequences? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner. And with the dessert on the table, they clustered around the fire by lamplight. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits. For it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour spare. Only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest had to find it out, he only answering their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questionings to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, that talked sometimes, that lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't led by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie, was never killed in the market, and was not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear. At every new question put to him, the nephew burst into a fresh round of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get off the sofa and stamp. At last, the plump sister cried out, "I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was. Uncle Scrooge had become imperceptibly so gay and light of heart, but the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit again upon their travels. Suddenly they stood before an open place. The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, but saw it no more. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifted up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist upon the ground toward him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before him. Lead on, the night is waning fast, and it is precious to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them. But there they were amongst the merchants. The spirit stopped beside a little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed toward them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin, "I don't know much about it either way. Only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. What has been done with his money?" asked the red-faced gentleman. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin. "He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to this conversation that seemed so trivial, but finding himself assured that it must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed toward his usual time for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in. They left this busy scene and went into an obscure part of town, to a low shop where iron, old rags, bottles, and bones were bought. A gray-haired rascal of great age sat smoking his pipe. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of his man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she was scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man and the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. Let the charwoman alone to be first," cried the one who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance, if we hadn't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met at a better place. What have you got to sell?" "Half a minute's patience, Joe, and you shall see." "Every person has a right to take care of themselves," said the woman. "He always did. And who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." Mrs. Dilber said, "No, indeed, ma'am." "If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, the wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd had someone to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last there, alone by himself. It's the truest word ever spoken. It's a judgment on him. I wish it had been a little heavier judgment, and it should have been, you may depend upon it, if I could have laid my hand upon anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be first, nor afraid to let them see it." Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening the bundle, and dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. "What do you call this? Bed curtains?" "Ah, bed curtains." "His blankets?" "Whose else do you think? He isn't likely to take gold without 'em, I dare say. You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it by dressing him up in it, if it hadn't been for me." Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. "Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. Life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?" The scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed. A pale light rising in the outer layer fell straight upon the bed, and on it, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this plundered, unknown man. "Spirit, let me see some tenderness in connection with the death, Spirit." The ghost conducted them to poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated around the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in needlework, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard these words? He had not dreamt them. The boy must have been reading them. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand to her face. "The color hurts my eyes," she said. "The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim. They'll be better now. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time." "Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting the book. "But I think he walks a little slower than he used to, these past few evenings. I have known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." And so have I, said Peter, often. And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob came in. His tea was ready for him upon the hob, and they all tried who should help him the most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek upon his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and the speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday. You went today then, Robert? Yes, my dear, returned Bob. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there upon a Sunday. My little child, my little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. Spectre, said Scrooge. Something informs me that our parting is at hand. I know, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was, with the covered face, whom we saw lying dead. The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him to a dismal, wretched churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Before I draw nearer to the stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Still, the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if persevered in, they must lead. But if the courses are departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The spirit was as immovable as ever. Scrooge crept toward it, trembling as he went, following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Am I that man that laid upon the bed? Oh, Spirit, no, no. Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope? Assure me that I may yet change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart. I will try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past and the present and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing from this stone. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the times before him were his own to make amends in. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night. Clear, bright, stirring, golden day. "What's today?" cried Scrooge, crying down to a boy in his Sunday clothes. "Eh? What's today, my fine fellow?" "Today? Why, Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?" "I should hope I did." "An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one." "What? The one as big as me?" "What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, me buck." "It's hanging there now." "Is it? Go and buy it." "Walk!" exclaimed the boy. No. I am in earnest. Go and buy it. Tell him to bring it here, that I may give him directions on where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, and somehow he went down and opened the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. It was a turkey. He could have never stood upon those legs, that bird. He would have snapped them off in a minute like sticks of sealing wax. Scrooge dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded every one of them with a delightful smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He went to church. He walked the streets. He watched the people hurrying to and fro, and he found everything could yield him pleasure. In the afternoon, he set his steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash, and he did it. "Is your master at home, my dear?" Scrooge said to the girl. "Yes, sir." "Where is he, my love?" "He's in the dining room with his mistress." "He knows me," said Scrooge, with his hand already on the dining room lock. "I'll go in here, my dear." "Fred!" "Well, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?" Let him in. It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be merrier. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. But he was early at the office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be the first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he set his heart upon. And he did it. The clock struck 9. No Bob. A quarter past. No Bob. Bob was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello?" growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, or as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming in here at this time of day?" "I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time." "You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, if you please." It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday." "Now I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," Scrooge continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore I am about to raise your salary." Bob trembled. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken, as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you in many a year. I'll raise your salary, and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs over this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires, and buy a second coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became a good friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good city or town or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived in that respect upon the total abstinence principle, ever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that truly be said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.